All right, guys, here is going to be a recap of the origins of clay diagram. We're gonna explore where clay comes from and how it gets to be where the clay that we use in class. So, clay starts in the mountains. And not just any mountains, but really, really big, significant mountain ranges. And a lot of times you can find these in India, China, and New Zealand. So it starts in these really, really significant mountain ranges. And what happens is a couple things happen in the mountains. So the first thing that happens is what we call chemical erosion. And the second thing that happens is a physical erosion. And anytime there's a type of erosion, it's basically a breakdown of the materials. So sometimes chemical erosion happens when different types of materials are reacting chemically with each other and then causing each other to break down. So that's going to happen. And the other thing that's happening is a physical erosion. And that's more where it's actually physically kind of interacting, different materials are physically interacting with each other to break each other down, kind of basically weaken different materials and cause them to break down and erode. So that's what's happening there. And usually at the bottom of these mountains, we get this nice little deposit of clay. And so this is our first type of clay, and we call it primary clay. So the same kind of naming conventions we used when we learned about the color wheel, we're going to use for clay as well. So you'll hear some familiar words. So primary clay, it's usually white in color. It can also be called kaolin or porcelain. And it's very expensive. So it's usually used for fine china, delicate pieces, small pieces. It's not really used in, big mass quantities of anything. It's a little bit more precious. So then the other thing that's happening along with our erosion is weather. And so when the rain and the snow hit the mountains, the water runs down the mountains, and that's how we form rivers. So at the base of our mountain, we're forming these rivers from the precipitation. And what happens is this water will go into our deposit of primary clay and pick up some primary clay and start taking it down the river. And on its way down the river, it's going to pick up some iron. It's going to pick up some sand. And it's going to pick up some other minerals. And this second type of clay that becomes a deposit along the river banks, we call it secondary clay. This clay is usually a gray color. sometimes light gray, sometimes dark gray, depending on how much of these minerals it has picked up. And it's also called stoneware. It's not as expensive as porcelain, but it's still a very good quality clay. So this is the type of clay that we primarily use in class because it's nice and easy to work with, and it's not super expensive, and we can kind of, get a lot of it and be experimenting with it. So we primarily use the secondary clay in class. However, we do have some primary clay we use for smaller pieces, and the next type of clay, which we also use. So the next thing that happens is our rivers, they start to fork. And they fork in these areas we call the wetlands. Kind of like the lagoons that go into the ocean that we have here. So in the wetlands, it's kind of, that grassy area. And while it is traveling through the rivers and then it starts going through the wetlands, it starts picking up more iron, more sand, and I'm going to put it over here, more minerals. And so the type of clay that deposits along the wetlands is our third type of clay, and you can probably guess what it's called: tertiary clay. So just like in the color wheel, we have primary, secondary, and tertiary colors. In clay, we have our primary clay, our secondary clay, and our tertiary clay. Tertiary clay is more red and brown, especially because of that iron. That's what gives it that color. We also call it earthenware. And this is the least expensive clay. So another name for this is terracotta, and that's probably a name that is familiar. Because terracotta is the name we use when we talk about things like terracotta pots and terracotta roofing tiles, and it's just used a lot more kind of abundantly because there is more of it and it's less expensive. So we use it for a lot of things that are going to be outside in the elements, large pots for plants, tiling for roofs. It's a little bit easier to replace if something gets broken, since it doesn't cost quite as much. So we do have some tertiary clay in class that we will use. And one thing you'll notice when you use these different types of clay is how different they feel. So the porcelain clay is very, very smooth, but almost a little too smooth where it's a little hard to work with. The secondary clay is very smooth, but a little bit easier to work with. But the tertiary clay, that's the one that feels the most different because you can actually feel the sand. It's like a little gritty and a bit exfoliating for your hands. So you'll get super soft hands when you use the terracotta clay. So that's it. That's the origins of clay diagram. So we start in the mountains, big time mountain ranges, not just the little hills we have here. Things that happen are chemical erosion and physical erosion, where different materials are coming in contact with each other, either based on what they're made up of chemically, or how they're physically interacting with each other. that breakdown happens, and at the bottom of the mountains we get our primary clay. The water that kind of forms from precipitation, it's going to run down these mountains and form rivers. And that water is going to pick up some of that primary clay and start carrying it down the rivers. It's going to pick up all of this and become secondary clay. And then as it continues on through the wetlands, it is going to pick up even more iron, sand, and minerals and become our third type of clay, our tertiary clay.